6 months had passed since the Battle of Kelvis Prime, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one had predicted. Commander Yoon Seojin stood on the steps of the Tribunal Hall in the Kelvani capital city, watching as guards led the last of the war criminals toward their judgment. Warlord Desok Ren walked in chains between human and Kelvani soldiers, his scales dull with age and defeat, and something that might have been acceptance. The tribunal had been running for 4 months, and 17 senior officials had already been convicted and executed for crimes against humanity. Desok Ren would be the 18th. Seojin did not feel joy watching him pass, only a cold satisfaction that justice was finally being served above the city. Human warships still held orbit alongside the remnants of the Kelvani fleet, and on the ground human soldiers patrolled beside Kelvani peacekeepers who had been carefully selected for their willingness to cooperate. The occupation was harsh, but not cruel. Methodical, but not vindictive. Humanity had come not to destroy the Kelvani, but to make them understand what they had done, and slowly, the Kelvani were beginning to understand. Sub-Commander Reska, now promoted to Fleet Commander of the reformed Kelvani Defense Force, stood beside Ambassador Kwon My-rae, watching the tribunal proceedings on a display screen. "I never thought I would see a warlord face justice," Reska said quietly. "Our people have never held our leaders accountable for anything." Kwon My-rae nodded. "That is going to change, Fleet Commander, because humanity will be watching, and we have long memories." Reska turned to look at the human ambassador. "You specifically requested that I be given this position, Ambassador, and I still do not understand why. Dr. Yoon Hajin told us what you did." Kwon My-rae replied, "You captured human survivors, and instead of executing them as your regulations demanded, you kept them alive and allowed our doctor to treat your wounded alongside our own." She smiled slightly. "That told us something about you, Fleet Commander. That told us you were capable of being better than what your leaders had made you." Reska stood in silence for a moment. "I do not deserve praise for basic decency, Ambassador." "No," Kwon My-rae agreed, "but in a species that had forgotten what basic decency looked like, you were a reminder that it could still exist. And that is why we wanted you to help build something new in the medical district of the capital." Dr. Yoon Hajin supervised the first class of Kelvani physicians to complete training in human hospitals. They had learned techniques and treatments that Kelvani medicine had never developed, and now they would return home to teach others what they had learned. "I never imagined working alongside humans," one of the Kelvani doctors admitted after what our people did. "I expected you to hate us forever." Hajin shook her head. "We do not have the energy to hate every Kelvani who ever lived. And we do not believe that every Kelvani was responsible for what happened." She looked at the young doctor with tired eyes. "The ones who gave the orders are being punished, and the ones who followed orders are being given a chance to prove they can be better. And if we cannot prove it," Hajin's expression hardened slightly, "then we will remember that too. And your children will grow up knowing that humanity gave you a chance and you wasted it." She softened again. "But I do not think that will happen. Doctor, I think your people are learning. I think someday we might actually be able to trust each other on the burned colony world of New Bizen." Reconstruction crews worked around the clock to rebuild what the Kelvani had destroyed. Kelvani laborers made up a significant portion of those crews, not as slaves but as paid workers fulfilling the reparations that their government had agreed to provide. They lived in temporary housing alongside human workers, ate in the same cafeterias, and slowly began to understand the enormity of what their people had done. Some of them wept when they saw the memorial walls being constructed, endless panels of names stretching toward the horizon. 890 million names that would never be forgotten. Others worked in silence with their heads down, unable to look at what their leaders had created, and some of them began to talk with the human workers, sharing stories and meals and slowly building the fragile beginnings of understanding. The High Assembly convened an emergency session to discuss humanity's new role in galactic affairs. And Archon Veleth Su presided over a debate that would determine the future of interstellar civilization, humanity, as demanded permanent seats on our highest councils. One delegate complained. They are a young species with no history of galactic diplomacy, and they have proven themselves capable of terrible violence. They have also proven themselves capable of mercy. Another delegate pointed out they could have destroyed Kelvis Prime completely, and instead they chose justice, and that tells me more about them than any history of diplomacy could. Balatsuo listened to the arguments and remembered the cold fury in Commander Seojin's eyes, remembered the fear that had gripped every species in the galaxy when humanity refused to stop. We have a choice, the ancient Archon announced finally. We can continue to treat humanity as outsiders and hope they never have reason to come for us the way they came for the Kelvani. The chamber fell silent. Or we can accept them as equals, work with them honestly, and build a relationship based on truth rather than the convenient lies we have told ourselves for too long. Velasiu looked around at the assembled delegates. I know which choice I prefer, and I suspect humanity knows which choice we will make, because they understand us better now than we understand ourselves. Ambassador Quan Mai addressed the assembly with humanity's terms for the future, and her voice carried across a galaxy that was finally ready to listen. We will trade with you and ally with you and help you when you need help, because that is what good neighbors do, and we want to be good neighbors. She paused and looked at each delegation in turn. But understand this and remember it forever. We do not forget. We never forget. And if you stand with us, we will stand with you until the stars burn out. Her eyes hardened. If you hurt us, you have seen what happens, and no truce will save you. On the memorial world of New Bizen, Commander Yun Seojin stood alone before a wall that contained the names of everyone she had known on the colony. Friends and neighbors and the family of soldiers who had served under her command. She placed flowers at the base of the wall and stood in silence. For a long moment, we did not forget you, she said quietly. We never will. Above her, human and Kelvani ships patrolled together on their first joint mission. Former enemies learning to work side by side under the watchful eyes of a galaxy that was still trying to understand what humanity had become. The High Assembly had offered truce 18 months ago, and humanity had refused because truce meant pretending nothing had happened. Now instead of false peace, there was real accountability. And instead of comfortable lies, there was painful truth. And instead of forgetting, there was a memorial that would stand for 1,000 years. The galaxy had learned something about humanity that would never be forgotten, hurt them, and they would come for you with everything they had. But spare them, and they would spare you. And if you earned their trust, they would stand beside you forever. The High Assembly had sought truce because they wanted things to go back to normal. Humanity had refused, because normal was not good enough. They had demanded something far more difficult than peace. They had demanded justice, and in the end, that made all the difference. Archon Vela Su had lived for 6,000 years and had seen the rise and fall of 100 civilizations. But nothing had prepared the ancient Desic for the cold silence of the human flagship. The journey to the Indomitable had taken 3 days. And during that time, Veleth Su Yu had watched human warships move into bombardment positions around Kelvis Prime like predators circling wounded prey. Now, the Archon stood before Commander Yun Se-yun with the weight of trillions of lives pressing down on every word. Thank you for receiving me, Commander, Veleth Su Yu began, its mandibles clicking softly with each translated syllable. I have come to make an offer that the Assembly has never made to any species in our recorded history. Seojin sat in her command chair, with Ambassador Kwan Mei standing at her right side and Captain Bei Jinwan at her left. "Speak." Seojin said simply. Velsasyu activated a holographic display that showed documents and treaties and financial transfers beyond anything Kelvani or human had ever seen. Full reparations. The Archon announced. Paid immediately from Assembly Reserve Funds. Not spread over centuries, but delivered now. Enough to rebuild every destroyed colony and compensate every family that lost someone. Seojin's expression did not change. War crimes tribunals, Velasquez continued, conducted by neutral species with real authority to punish those responsible. Not symbolic gestures, but actual justice with imprisonment and execution for those found guilty. Still nothing from the human commander. Technology transfers, the Arkham pressed on. Medical and agricultural and industrial advances that would take your species centuries to develop on your own. Given freely as acknowledgement of what was done to you. Velaisu lowered its forelimbs in the Desic gesture of complete submission, preferred trade status. Defensive alliances, seats on assembly councils that have never been offered to a species as young as humanity. All of this and more if you will accept one condition. Seijin leaned forward slightly. And that condition, do not destroy Kelvis Prime, Velethsiu said. And for the first time, emotion crept into its translated voice. Do not commit genocide in response to genocide. Do not become what you have fought against. The bridge fell silent, except for the soft hum of ship systems and the distant thunder of engines. Ambassador Kwan Mai spoke quietly. Why does the Assembly suddenly care about Kalvani lives? Archon, when you did not care about human lives 16 months ago? Velasiu's compound eyes shifted between the humans. And the ancient creature seemed to deflate slightly. I will tell you the truth, it said. Because I believe you have earned truth even if it is ugly. The Archon's body trembled slightly. We do not care about the Kelvani. Ambassador, we are terrified of humanity. Seijin and Kwan Mai exchanged glances but said nothing. Every species in this galaxy watched the Kelvani attack your worlds. Velasuo continued. We expected you to defend yourselves for a time and then negotiate. As every species does when faced with overwhelming force. The Archon's mandibles clicked rapidly in what might have been distress. Instead, you mobilized everything. Every ship and every soldier and every resource your civilization possessed. And you came across the galaxy, not to defend your territory, but to punish those who had hurt you. Velethsuo looked directly at Sijin. No species has ever done this before. Commander, no species has ever been willing to sacrifice everything simply to make certain that an enemy paid for what they did. Captain Jinwan shifted uncomfortably. And even Kwan Mai seemed taken aback by the raw fear in the Archon's voice. If you destroy Kelvis Prime, Velethsu said slowly, every species in the galaxy will understand the message you are sending, that if anyone hurts humanity, humanity will end them completely, without negotiation or mercy or any limit at all. Seojin nodded slowly. And you believe this would be a bad thing? The Archon's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. It terrifies us. Commander, because someday one of our species might make a mistake. Might hurt humans without meaning to, or through some misunderstanding or accident of fate. Velasu's compound eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. And if that happens, you will come for us the same way you came for the Kelvani. And there will be no words we can say to stop you. Silence stretched through the bridge as the weight of the Archon's words settled over everyone present. Seojin stood slowly from her chair and walked to the main viewport where Kelvis Prime hung in the void below. Beautiful and blue and full of billions of lives. You are right to be afraid, she said without turning around. We did cross the galaxy to punish the Kelvani. And we were prepared to sacrifice everything to do it. Because what they did to us cannot be allowed to stand. She turned to face Valasuyu. But you are wrong about one thing. Archon. What is that, Commander? We do not want to be monsters. Seojin said quietly. We do not want to be the terror that haunts this galaxy, destroying anyone who offends us without thought or mercy. She walked slowly back toward the Archon. That is what the Kelvani were. And we have spent 16 months fighting to prove that such things cannot be allowed to exist. Quan Mireille stepped forward. What the commander is saying, Archon, is that we are open to alternatives, but the alternative cannot be a return to how things were before. Valasu's mandibles clicked hopefully. What would you propose? Seojin looked at Quan Mireille, and something passed between them that needed no words. We will not bombard Kelvis Prime, Seojin said. We will not kill billions of innocent Kelvani who had no part in the decision to attack our worlds. The relief that washed over Velasu was visible in every part of its ancient body. But, Seojin continued, and her voice turned cold again, we will not simply leave either. And we will not accept symbolic tribunals or distant reparations or promises that mean nothing. She stepped closer to the Archon until they were almost touching. We want the ones who gave the orders. Archon, every official and officer and politician who decided to burn our worlds and murder our children. We want them handed over for real justice. Valasu hesitated. The Kelvani will never agree to surrender their leaders. Then we will take them ourselves. Seojin replied. We will occupy Kelvis Prime, and we will hold it until every war criminal has been found and tried and punished. The Archon's body stiffened. Occupation would be unprecedented. So was burning 3 worlds to intimidate a species into submission. Quan Mireille pointed out, we are not asking for anything the Kelvani did not bring upon themselves. Valasuyu stood in silence for a long moment. Ancient mind working through the implications of what the humans were proposing. It was not genocide, but it was also not the quiet forgiveness the Assembly had hoped for. It was something harder and more complicated and far more difficult. To argue against, I will present your terms to the Assembly, the Archon said finally. Whether they accept will be their choice. But I will tell them that this is the only offer humanity is willing to make. Seojin nodded. Tell them one more thing. Archon, what is that? Tell them that we remember, Seojin said quietly. Tell them that we will always remember, and that anyone who thinks about hurting us should remember too. Valasuyu bowed its ancient head and turned to leave. At the door it paused and looked back, for what it is worth. Commander, I believe your terms are just... And I am sorry that it took so much death for us to finally speak honestly with one another. Seojin watched the Archon go and said nothing above Kelvis Prime. Human ships held their positions and waited for an answer that would determine the fate of 2 civilizations. The Assembly would agree to humanity's terms. Seojin already knew this. They were too afraid to refuse. The Battle of Kelvis Prime began at sunrise over the Kelvani homeworld, and it would be remembered as the largest fleet engagement in the history of the galaxy. Commander Yun Seojin stood on the bridge of the Indomitable watching 1,000 human warships spread across the void like stars made of steel, and across from them, the remaining Kelvani fleet formed a desperate wall between humanity and their world. Warlord Desok Ren commanded the Kelvani defense from his flagship, and as he watched the human formations advance, he felt something he had not felt in 50 years of conquest. He felt afraid the Kelvani had built their empire on the simple truth that other species would always seek peace when the cost of war became too high. They had conquered 12 worlds using this strategy, attacking with overwhelming force until their enemies chose negotiation over destruction. But the humans were different. Desok Ren had ordered the attacks on the human colonies himself, and he had broadcast the footage of burning cities because he wanted to terrify them into surrender. Instead, he had made them angry. The first human missiles struck the Kelvani defensive line, and the void lit up with the fire of 1,000 explosions. Sub-Commander Reska gripped her console as her cruiser shuddered under the impact of weapons more powerful than anything she had faced before. She was young for a Kelvani officer, barely 40 years old in a species that lived for centuries, and she had never questioned the rightness of her people's conquests until now. Forward batteries. Return fire, her captain ordered, and Reska relayed the command while watching human ships cut through their formation like predators through prey. The humans fought without mercy, but also without waste. Each shot precisely aimed, and each maneuver calculated for maximum effect. They were not raging or wild or out of control. They were methodical, that terrified Reska more than anything else on the Indomitable. Dejar Yunhajin worked in the medical bay as wounded soldiers were brought in from damaged ships. She had been a civilian physician before the war, treating children and elderly patients in a quiet hospital on Earth. But when the Kelvani broadcast their footage of burning colonies, she had volunteered for military service within the hour. Now she stood covered in blood that was not always red, her hands moving automatically to save lives while her mind tried not to think about how many she could not save. "Doctor," one of her nurses called out. "We have incoming wounded from the destroyer Gimhe, and some of them are not human." Hejin looked up to see medics carrying in bodies of both species, human and Kelvani, mixed together from a ship that had been boarded during the fighting. "Treat them all," she said without hesitation. "Triage by severity, not by species." The nurse stared at her for a moment. "Doctor, these are Kelvani. They killed our people, and right now they are dying people." Hajin replied firmly. "We can hate them and save them at the same time, because that is what makes us different from them." Across the battlefield, Warlord Desok Ren watched his fleet crumble and finally understood his mistake. When the Kelvani attacked other species, those species fought to defend their territory and then negotiated when defense became too costly. The humans were not defending anything. They had crossed half the galaxy to attack, leaving their own worlds unguarded because they did not care about protection anymore. They only cared about punishment. "Signal all ships to fall back to planetary defense positions," Desok Ren ordered, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. His fleet had been the largest in Kelvani history, and now more than half of it was burning wreckage, drifting through the void. His second-in-command approached with a communication tablet. "Warlord, the High Assembly is demanding we request another truce." Desok Ren laughed bitterly. The humans refused truce when they were winning, and they will not accept it now when victory is in their grasp. He stared at the tactical display, where human ships were systematically destroying every Kelvani vessel that could not retreat fast enough. "We taught them to be merciless," he said quietly. "We showed them what happens when you show weakness to your enemies. And now they are showing us the same lesson." Sub-Commander Reska's cruiser limped away from the main battle with half its systems destroyed and a third of its crew dead. Her captain was among the casualties, killed when a human missile had breached the bridge. And now Reska found herself in command of a broken ship with nowhere to go. "Sub-Commander," her sensor officer reported, "we are detecting a small human vessel, possibly an escape pod, drifting nearby." Reska checked the readings and saw that the pod was damaged and venting. "Atmosphere slowly. How many life signs?" 7, all human. Several appeared to be wounded. Protocol was clear on this matter. Captured humans were to be executed immediately to prevent them from causing trouble or gathering. Intelligence Reska had followed that protocol before, had watched prisoners die, and told herself it was necessary. But today something felt different. "Bring them aboard," she ordered. Her officers stared at her in shock. "Sub-Commander, the regulations..." "I know the regulations." Reska cut them off. "Bring them aboard and take them to medical." The human survivors were brought to the cruiser's small medical bay. And when Reska arrived to check on them, she found one of the wounded humans treating the injuries of the others. Dr. Yoonhaejin had been aboard the escape pod when it was captured, and she had immediately begun providing medical care, despite having no supplies and no knowledge of whether she would be killed. Reska watched the human doctor work and noticed that she was also treating the wounded Kelvani crew members who had been brought to the same bay. "Why are you helping them?" Reska asked. Hajin looked up at the Kelvani officer with tired eyes. "They are dying, and I am a doctor, so I help people who are dying, even those who would kill you." Hajin considered the question while bandaging a Kelvani soldier's burned arm. "Your soldiers followed orders, and some of those orders were terrible, but the soldiers themselves were just doing what they were told." She finished the bandage and moved to another patient. "The ones who gave the orders, the ones who decided to burn our worlds and murder our children, they are the ones we want, not every Kelvani who ever wore a uniform." Reska did not understand, "But your fleet is not sparing our soldiers in battle." "Battle is different," Hajin admitted. "In battle, everyone is trying to kill everyone else, and we cannot stop to sort out who is guilty and who is just following orders." She gestured at the wounded around her. "But here, when the fighting is done and people are just hurt and scared, that is when we remember that we are supposed to be better than what happened to us." Reska stood silently for a long moment watching this. Strange humans save lives without asking whose lives they were. Then she left the medical bay and gave orders to retreat toward the homeworld with her human prisoners still alive. She did not know why she had spared them. She only knew that something had changed inside her, and she could not go back to what she had been before, above Kelvis Prime. The battle was ending, the Kelvani fleet had been shattered, and the survivors were fleeing to the surface while human ships moved into position around the planet Commander. Seojin looked down at the world that had sent ships to burn her people, and she considered what would happen next. The High Assembly was sending one final delegation to beg for mercy. Seojin would hear what they had to say, but she already knew that mercy was not what humanity had come to deliver. The human flagship Indomitable cut through the void of space like a blade made of steel and fury, and in its wake, 1,000 warships followed in perfect formation. Captain Bae Jinhwan stood on the observation deck watching the stars streak past, and he wondered if the alien delegations waiting in the diplomatic bay understood what they were asking. 5 species had sent representatives to negotiate with the advancing human fleet, and none of them seemed to realize that words would not be enough. Commander Yoon Seojin had given him orders to treat the delegations with courtesy and respect, because humans were not savages, no matter what the galaxy might think. But she had also made clear that no offer would stop the advance. Jinhwan straightened his uniform and walked toward the diplomatic bay where the first delegation waited. The Varathi were strange creatures who breathed methane and saw the universe in wavelengths that human eyes could not perceive, and their emissary Sholven had traveled a long way to speak with humanity. Captain Bay, Sholven said through its translator, its voice carrying warmth that seemed genuine. "Thank you for receiving us during such difficult times." Jinhwan nodded and gestured for the emissary to sit. "The commander appreciates the Varathi taking time to visit, though she wonders what you hope to accomplish." Sholven's body shifted in what might have been a shrug. "We hope to offer something of value, Captain. Something that might ease your people's suffering." The emissary activated a small projector that displayed technical schematics in the air between them. "Terraforming technology," Sholven explained, "the most advanced in the galaxy, capable of restoring your burned colony worlds to habitability within a single generation." Jinhwan studied the schematics with genuine interest. New Bizon and the other devastated worlds were still smoking ruins where nothing could grow and nothing could live. This technology could bring them back, and in exchange, Jinwan said quietly. Chauvin's body sagged slightly. In exchange, we ask that you stop your advance and accept the Assembly's truce. Jinwan nodded slowly and stood. I will bring this to the commander's attention, but I will also tell you what she will say. He looked at the emissary with something like respect. She will say that we can rebuild our worlds ourselves, even if it takes 10 generations instead of one, because accepting gifts from those who watched our people die would poison everything we build. Chauvin did not argue. It simply lowered its head and waited while Jinwan moved to the next delegation. The Orinthi were delicate beings who floated rather than walked, and their high cleric Numas radiated an aura of peace that seemed to calm the very air around it. Violence begets violence, Numas said in a voice like wind through chimes. Your people have suffered greatly, Captain, but continuing this war will only create more suffering for everyone. Jinwan listened as the cleric spoke of forgiveness and spiritual transcendence, of letting go of anger before it consumed the soul. The Orinthi offered humanity membership in their peaceful federation where weapons were forbidden and conflicts were resolved through meditation and understanding. We do not ask you to forget, Numas said gently. We ask you to rise above, to show the galaxy that humanity can be greater than its pain. Jinwan thought about the soldiers he had lost in the counteroffensive, friends who had died screaming in the vacuum of space while Kelvani weapons tore through their ships. He thought about what they would say if they could hear this offer. High Cleric, he said finally, my people respect those who choose peace, but we did not start this war, and we will not allow those who did to escape without consequence. He paused and chose his next words carefully. Perhaps when this is over, we will have time for meditation and understanding. But right now, we have a duty to the dead that we will not abandon. Numas floated silently for a long moment. I will pray for you, Captain. Pray for the Kelvani. Jinwan replied. They are the ones who will need it. The Desic delegation was led by a minor official who delivered threats rather than offers economic sanctions. Trade embargoes, complete isolation from galactic commerce. Jinwan listened politely and then showed them to their shuttle without comment. The Morhan offered binding arbitration with neutral enforcement, and Jinwan explained that humanity no longer trusted neutral parties to enforce anything for delegations. 4 refusals and still the fleet advanced. It was late in the ship's night cycle when emissary Chauvin requested a private meeting with Commander Seojin herself. Jinwan brought the Varathi to the commander's quarters where Seojin waited with Ambassador Quan Mai at her side. Commander, Chauvin said, and its voice was different now, less formal and more tired. I have something to tell you that I should not say, but I believe you deserve to hear it. Seojin gestured for the emissary to continue. The assembly did not stay neutral because they believed it was right. Chauvin admitted they stayed neutral because they were afraid of the Kelvani. The words hung in the air like smoke. The Dominion had threatened to expand their attacks to any species that intervened, and the Assembly calculated that your 3 colony worlds were an acceptable loss compared to the risk of wider war. Seojin's face did not change, but Jinwan saw her hands tighten slightly behind her back. You are saying, Quan Mai said slowly, that the Assembly let our people die because it was convenient. Chauvin's body trembled slightly. I am saying that we were cowards, Ambassador, and I am ashamed of what we allowed to happen. Seojin studied the emissary for a long moment. I appreciate your honesty, she said finally. It is the first honest thing any of you have said since this began. Chauvin straightened with what might have been hope. Does this change anything? Commander, Seojin shook her head slowly. It confirms what we already suspected, but it changes nothing. Because understanding why someone betrayed you does not mean you can trust them again. She turned to Jinwan, see the emissary back to their shuttle. Captain, and then informed the fleet to increase speed. Jinwan saluted and led Shulven away behind them. Quan Myray was already composing a message to Earth Command, and the response came within the hour. It was a single word: finish it. The human fleet crossed into Kelvani core territory at dawn, and the stars ahead burned with the light of a civilization that was about to learn what it meant to hurt humanity. The High Assembly watched from their distant stations and wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. They had offered truce, and humanity had refused. Now there would be a reckoning. The Concord station hung in the light of a dying star, and inside its great hall, the representatives of 12 species waited in silence for the humans to speak. Commander Yun Seojin stood at the center of the chamber with her hands clasped behind her back, and her face showing nothing at all. She had traveled 14 days through hostile space to reach this place, and she had not slept more than 3 hours on any of those nights. Beside her stood Ambassador Quan Myray, whose diplomatic robes seemed too bright against the dark metal walls of the station. The High Assembly had called this emergency session because they were afraid, and Seojin knew exactly what they feared. They feared her Archon Velithsiu rose from the central platform, its insectoid body clicking and shifting as it arranged itself to speak. The Lessig were ancient creatures who had watched empires rise and fall across 10,000 years, and Velithsiu had seen more wars than any being in the galaxy. We have gathered here to discuss the conflict between the Terran Union and the Kelvani Dominion, Velithsiu announced, its translator rendering the clicks and whistles into words that echoed through the chamber. The Assembly has reviewed the situation and prepared terms for immediate cessation of hostilities. Seojin did not move. She remembered the day the news had reached Earth Command. 16 months ago, when the Kelvani fleet had appeared above the colony world of New Bizan. She remembered watching the footage that the Kelvani had broadcast across every human frequency, showing their soldiers marching through burning streets, while families ran screaming into the flames. She remembered counting the dead, 890 million souls across 3 worlds. And the Kelvani had laughed while they burned. Fleet Marshal Drome sat among the Assembly representatives, his reptilian scales gleaming under the station lights. He was the one who had ordered those attacks, and now he sat in a comfortable chair while diplomats discussed peace. Seojin looked at him, and Drome looked away. The proposed terms are as follows, Velithsiu continued, activating a display that floated in the air above the chamber. Immediate ceasefire along all fronts, withdrawal to pre-war boundaries, and reparations to be paid by the Kelvani Dominion over a period of 300 standard years. 300 years, Seojin almost smiled at that. The Kelvani had burned 3 worlds in 16 months, and the Assembly wanted them to pay it back over 3 centuries. By then, everyone who remembered the dead would be dead themselves. The Assembly recognizes that the Terran Union has suffered great losses, Velithsiu said, and its voice carried what might have been sympathy. We also recognize that your counteroffensive has achieved remarkable success, destroying 60% of the Kelvani fleet and advancing deep into their territory. Remarkable success. Those were interesting words for what our people had done. Every ship that could fly had been sent to the front. Every factory converted to war production. Every citizen who could hold a weapon trained and deployed. Humanity had not achieved remarkable success. Humanity had chosen to fight until there was nothing left to fight with. And the Kelvani had not expected that. No species in the galaxy had expected that. However, Velithsiu continued, the Assembly believes that continued conflict serves no productive purpose, and we urge the Terran Union to accept these terms in the interest of galactic stability. The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to Seojin, waiting for her response. She let them wait. She thought about the memorial halls being built on Earth, where the names of the dead would be carved into walls that stretched for kilometers. She thought about the children who would grow up without parents, and the parents who would grow old without children. She thought about Fleet Marshal Drum sitting in his comfortable chair. Waiting to go home? No? Seojin said. The word hung in the air like the echo of a gunshot. Velith's mandibles clicked rapidly in what might have been confusion. Commander, perhaps you do not understand the full implications. I understand perfectly, Seojin interrupted, and her voice was calm and cold. You want us to stop fighting, go back to our borders, and pretend that the Kelvani did not murder almost 1 billion of our people. The reparations mean nothing. Seojin said, you cannot pay back the dead with credits spread over 300 years. And you cannot erase what happened by drawing lines on a map. Velith's hue shifted uncomfortably. Then, what does the Terran Union propose? Seojin looked around the chamber at the representatives of 12 species who had watched the Kelvani burn human worlds and done nothing. We propose to continue our advance until we reach Kelvis Prime, she said. We propose to hold the Kelvani accountable for every life they took. And we propose to make certain that no species in this galaxy ever believes they can do this to us again. The chamber erupted in noise as 12 different species began talking at once. Fleet Marshal Drome was on his feet. His scales flushed dark with what might have been fear or rage. This is barbarism, he snarled. You would destroy an entire civilization over a military conflict. Seojin turned to face him directly, and something in her eyes made him step back. You broadcast footage of our cities burning, she said quietly. You showed your soldiers laughing while our children died. And you sent that footage to every human colony so we would know what was coming for us. Drum said nothing. That was not a military conflict. Seojin continued. That was a message. And now we are sending one of our own. Velith's Hue raised its forelimbs in a gesture of urgency. Commander, if the Terran Union refuses this truce, the Assembly will have no choice but to impose sanctions, and your species will become a pariah among galactic civilizations. Ambassador Quan Mai stepped forward for the first time, her voice soft but steady. Archon, may I ask a question? Velith's Hue gestured for her to continue. When the Kelvani attacked our colony worlds, the Assembly called an emergency session to discuss the situation, just as you have done today. That is correct. And what did the Assembly decide to do? Velith's Hue hesitated. The Assembly determined that direct intervention would risk expanding the conflict and potentially destabilizing the region. In other words, Quan Mai said, you decided to do nothing while they murdered our people. Silence fell across the chamber. You watched. Quan Mai continued. You watched them burn our children. And you called it neutrality. And now you want us to care about your opinion of us. She shook her head slowly. Your opinion means nothing to us now. Seojin turned and walked toward the chamber exit. And Quan Mai followed Commander Yun. Velith's Hue called out. If you leave this station without accepting the truce, there will be consequences. Seojin stopped at the door and looked back over her shoulder. We know, she said. We stopped caring about consequences 16 months ago when you taught us that no one in this galaxy would help us. She stepped through the door and did not look back again. Outside the station, the human fleet was already moving. 1,000 warships advancing toward Kelvani space with orders to stop for nothing. The High Assembly watched them go. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the ancient powers of the galaxy felt something they had almost forgotten. They felt afraid because humanity was not fighting for territory or resources or political advantage. Humanity was fighting because the Kelvani had hurt them. And humanity had decided that such things could not be allowed to stand. The Assembly had offered peace, and humanity had refused. Now they would learn what that refusal meant.